Thank you very much. Without wasting time, let me introduce the next moderator for the next session so that we can welcome the next speaker. Our next moderator is none other than Ms. Justina Mkoko, again my teacher at high school. Justina Mkoko is the National Director of Zimbabwe Peace Project. The Zimbabwe Peace Project is a non-profit organization which monitors and documents human rights violations and breaches of peace to advance sustainable peace in Zimbabwe. She's a victim of state-sponsored violence. Justina details the experience as a victim of human rights violation in her book, The Abduction and Trial of Justina Mkoko, The Fight for Human Rights in Zimbabwe, released in April 2016. A political scientist from the University of Zimbabwe, she holds a postgraduate certificate in defending human rights from the University of York, holder of an executive master's degree in managing peace and security in Africa with the Institute for Peace and Security Studies. She is a newly accredited FEMWISE Africa mediator. The Institute of Directors Zimbabwe in the past few weeks recognized Justina as one of the 50 inspirational women in 2020 and 2021. Justina is an award-winning human rights and peace campaigner who is a well-known and respected civil society leader, who is the recent past chair of the Zimbabwe Human Rights Non-Governmental Organization Forum after serving 2 years. I welcome you, Ms. Justina Mkoko, to the podium to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It seems that you are going back in your history, introducing your teachers one after the other. So good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are catching us from. And as already been said, my name is Justina Mkoko, and I work with the Zimbabwe Peace Project, an organization that monitors and documents breaches of peace. Today I'm privileged, and it is my great honor to moderate a session where the iconic Professor Patrick Lok Otieno Lumumba is going to be addressing us. Allow me to go through his bio. Professor Lumumba.
Perhaps the bio should just be as you've said. I think people can read the bio.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that. I think all of us around the table know the kind of men we are going to be listening.
Thank you very much.
And
thank you very
Professor
much,
Lumumba
Christina.
is going to assist us to interrogate the role of the European Union and NATO in promoting sustainable peace, Russia and Ukraine as the case study. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much. I hope the volume is good enough and that I can be heard clearly.
I can hear you very clearly.
Let me
crystal
preface my presentation by saying that I'm not an expert in this area, and therefore my contribution must be seen in the context of a curious human being who follows trends in the world. And the judgment, therefore, should be not as hard as it ordinarily should be, because I'm no expert in the area. Let me start by saying that if I had been asked to constitute the title of this particular contribution, I would have said interrogating the role of NATO and EU in sustaining the war in Russia and Ukraine. Because as it is now, from my perspective, they are not promoting sustainable peace. In my view, they are sustaining the war for whatever reason. But let us ask ourselves, what was the foundation of these organizations? Starting as we should with NATO. Many of you will remember that NATO, like other multinational organizations, including the United Nations Organization, are products of the so-called Second World War. And see, I deliberately say so-called, because fundamentally these were European tribal wars. And we were simply involved in order to call them world wars. But be that as it may, the truth be told that when the world met in 1945 in San Francisco in the United States of America, giving birth to what we now call the United Nations under the Charter, the appetite for peace was very high and very deep. And it's in that context, therefore, that you see Chapter 7 of the UN Charter that is pretty clear as to how you want to deal with sustainable peace after the two world wars in 1914 to 18, and once again in 1939 through to 1945. Europe has been devastated. Even the United States of America, which is not directly involved, has to underwrite the costs of bringing up Europe to the Marshall Plan. And you can see that after 1945,
my apologies, Prof.
There is a deliberate effort to ensure that there is sustainable peace. After
My apologies, Prof.
we then see the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Paris. Then immediately after that, you see the 1949 Geneva Conventions relative to war, and ultimately we come up with NATO. Because notwithstanding that Nazi Germany have been defeated at the war, the world is immediately descending into a bipolar world. So suspicion reigns supreme, and the Soviet Union has its own fiefdom in the territories that it has retained. And there is in truth, therefore, there are two hegemons in the world. The conceptual West, led by the United States of America, and the so-called East, led by the Soviet Union, complete with what was then known as Eastern Europe, many of which have now decamped and gone to the NATO side. So when NATO is created as a North Atlantic alliance for purposes of defense, it is actually conceived in the context of a world that is still governed by suspicion. The United States of America is aware that the erstwhile colonizers, namely the European countries, have been so devastated that they have no capacity nor appetite even for retaining their former colonies. And you can see at that time that the process of decolonization begins in earnest. And we see most of the colonies that were under the tutelage, whether of the British, the French, or the Germans, or the Italians, or the Belgians, the agitation domestically and the reality in the world is such that we have this era of decolonization. It is also noteworthy that during that period in 1945, we have the first Pan-African movement meeting in Manchester in the United Kingdom. So NATO is created as a bulwark against a Soviet Union that is unpredictable. And you can see that with the series of meetings involving Churchill, involving Roosevelt, involving Joseph Stalin, and the Yalta agreements. So NATO can see that going forward, there is a possibility of another war. And you and me know that the reality in the world is still dictated by the law of the jungle, survival of the fittest and the dying of the least suitable. And the possession of nuclear armaments also becomes very critical at this particular time, because the philosophy is what is normally referred to as MUD, mutually assured destruction. so that when everybody knows that they can be destroyed by the other, then tenuous peace is sustained. NATO must therefore be seen in that context. The DNA and the anatomy of NATO at once is to ensure that what is referred to as the unveiling of the red carpet is stopped, so that it does not move beyond Berlin, which, as you know, is divided. It is instructive that NATO is being founded at a time when one would have assumed that the UN would be sufficient. But the European system and the Europeans and the Americans want to create a body which, in my submission, is capable of bypassing the UN. So understand NATO, its pretenses to the contrary notwithstanding, that it is also something in the nature of an organization which is designed to bypass the UN system, because the UN system has the Soviet Union, the UN system has China, and these can veto certain activities, and they can see that in order to operate outside of that environment, they need something else that can operate without consulting the UN system or by merely defying the UN system. So NATO must be understood as a military organization, and it doesn't pretend to the contrary. And of course, it has no standing army. It can activate its members. It has a very loose chain of command. But the truth be told, that NATO is fundamentally controlled from the United States of America, which, as I've already said, is the hegemon, which still has great appetite for world dominance. And I think if there is any one American president who said it very well, it was Ronald Reagan, who said that America needs to be feared, not to be loved. And you remember he said this when NATO had bombed Libya. So that is the context in which one should understand NATO. The European Economic Community, which comes into being in 1958, on the other hand, is informed by the reality in Europe. Europe has been bombed to the ground, devastated, weak economies, their industries are gone, their umbilical cord with their former colonies has also been weakened. Therefore, they recognize, and these are some of the arguments that we'll see in some of the writings that speak about the European Economic Community, that one of the ways in which we can avoid war is to create an environment where there is trade, enhanced trade, where there is free movement of peoples. And the argument at that time is that when there is trade, when there are no tariff and non-tariff barriers, and people are trading, then the appetite for war is reduced. The possibility for war is reduced. And I therefore hold the view that the European Union that is founded in 1958 is a product of fear. It is a product of the realization that war can be devastating if they did not know that after the World War I. It is informed by the realization that Europe must not go to war again. So it has very innocent and, if you may, very noble objectives. But the process of metamorphosis begins to take place, because remember that most of these European powers are also in a world which is multipolar. They are members of the United Nations Organization. The United Nations Organization after 1963 now has a wave of the newly independent countries, which on a head count outnumber the Europeans, who of course still control the UN through the veto powers. So the European Union begins to change. And the change in the European Union is also organized and informed by the realities that are taking place in the continent. Remember the Soviet Union is also beyond the military arrangements, beginning to enter into an economic arrangement. And it is in that regard that you must also understand the creation of the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact, which brings together the countries that support and subscribe both to the political and economic prescriptions of the Soviet Union as articulated by Marx and Lenin, and of course revised by Joseph Stalin. And the European Union therefore begins to metamorphosize. It is no longer merely an economic body. And that is why in 1993, the European Union changes its name. It is no longer European Economic Community, but it's the European Union. And they realize that it must now enter into certain arena, which was hitherto not the prescribed mandate of the European Economic Community. They are now getting into under the Copenhagen rules, which you'll be familiar with. If you want to be a member of the union, there are boxes that you must tick. They define that it must be the rule of law, which must be European, the human rights. You've got to have people representation justifying the creation of the European Parliament. You've got to talk about peace and security and stability. So the European Union does enlarge its mandate. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, the European Union begins, although it does not say so loudly, it begins to swallow some of the members of the former Soviet Union. Remember, the Soviet Union collapses, and that is a catalyst for a number of things. There is the domino effect. We see the domino effect that brings the death of Yugoslavia. We see the domino effect that leads to the creation of many other states, the reunification of Germany. And at the back of their mind, they can remember that the Soviet Union was capable of interfering with peace and tranquility in Europe. They are remembering what happened with the Soviet intervention in what was then Czechoslovakia. They are also remembering what happened with the spring in Hungary, in Budapest. The European Union therefore changes in that regard. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they now see Russia as the enemy. But you remember, when the Soviet Union is collapsing, there is also fear on the part of Russia, which is the immediate successor of the Soviet Union, that you do not want next to your borders a European Union which in truth is hostile to you, which in truth intends to undermine you politically, intends to undermine you militarily, intends to undermine you economically. And they are remembering in 1990s when they say that the Soviet Union, rather that the NATO and the European Union will not extend beyond certain boundaries. They are remembering the American behavior in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And therefore, when they see that the Soviet Union or rather Russia takes the view that the European Union has crossed the Rubicon, if I may borrow that from the Romans, has crossed the Rubicon and is inching closer and closer to their border, they can ignore little countries such as Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, which are the Baltic states. They can ignore Georgia. But when it gets to Ukraine, which, as you remember, was differently structured. In fact, you will remember that during the Soviet Union, Ukraine was the navel or the center, as you will, of research in science and nuclear technology. And now the Europeans and the Americans are surreptitiously engaging with the Europeans and with the Americans with a view in the mind of the Russians to undermine the Soviet Union, rather to undermine Russia, excuse me for being held up in the history of the Soviet Union, to undermine Russia. Then the Russians are saying they have crossed the line. And one begins to see the engagements. You remember Yanukovych when Yanukovych was driven out of town, and we have these individuals, Zelensky, who comes in, and it's very difficult to tell when he is acting and not acting. I'm being very uncharitable to him. But that is what emerges to me, that when the Soviet Union, I personally thought that there would be no invasion of Ukraine. I thought that what Putin was doing was merely saber rattling, and that saber rattling was designed to bring the Ukrainians to the table. And it is at that time that I thought that if NATO and the European Union were interested in peace, that was the time at which they would have midwifed peace. They would have convened a round table meeting at that time under the aegis either of NATO or of the European Union, or if the Russians did not want it, under the aegis of the United Nations, and brokered an understanding. And that understanding would have been, in my view, what sometimes is called Finlandization. You remember the history of Finland, when it was agreed that Finland would remain neutral in order for it not to be a threat to the Soviet Union, or to remain neutral in the nature of Switzerland so that they don't get into the European Union. And the Russians are not averse to countries joining the European Union as long as it is simply an economic bloc. But when it emerged that even the laboratories in the Ukraine were sites for collaboration for biological weapons, of course, this has not been acknowledged. The Soviet Union said that we must engage in what is known as preemptive defense. And you also are aware that prior to that, there was disharmony, there was the assumption or the belief in Moscow that the Ukrainians were discriminating against the Soviet nationals, or rather the Soviet nation in Donetsk and Luhansk. And you will also remember that the Russians also took the view that if you continue to have hostile Ukraine in the Baltic Sea, then you are in mortal danger. And when the NATO countries and the European Union squandered the opportunity to broker peace, and the Russians then ignited what they call a security operation, and what the Western world and Western media now calls, and of course the Ukrainians themselves call, an invasion of Ukraine. It cannot be said that NATO and indeed the European Union have tried to bring about peace. You and me are aware that what has been happening since the commencement of this operation, or this invasion, or this war, is that the NATO countries have, in my view, been urging Ukraine on. When people are fighting and you tell them, we are going to provide you with armaments, we are going to do this to you, we are going to do this for you, we are going to do this with you, you are not creating an environment for peace. The net effect is that it has created a hardening of positions by both the Ukrainians, who believe that they are being supported by NATO and the European Union, and a hardening on the part of the Russians, who now believe that the war that is being fought is not a war against Ukraine, but Ukraine is a theater of war. But this is a war against NATO and the European Union. And that is how the attempts at negotiations, which started in Turkey, have been torpedoed. That is why even the rhetoric from the UN, from Guterres, have become very weak. And what people are now talking about, and even NATO and European strategists are now saying, that this is a war that is going to go on for the long haul. And that is not the kind of language that you expect from bodies that want peace. Remember that this is also a very good environment for those who are in the industry of armament. They are now selling their arms. They are now testing some of their arms that had not been tested in the theater of war. And in my view, the European approach, the NATO approach, is catalyzing this war. And remember that NATO and the EU meet at different forums under different mutations. Right now, as I speak, they are meeting at the G7. It's the same thing. They meet at the G7, they meet at the European Union, they meet as NATO, the same thing, and creating the impression, therefore, that the entire world is on their side. And of course, you saw very recently when Zelensky requested to address the AU, only 4 heads of state attended the African heads of state. And I thought that was a very good thing, because I hold the view that to the extent that that war has a global impact, we should not be drawn merely as cannon fodder in a war whose genesis we do not understand, in a war which is being perpetuated by European powers which have no regard for Africa. And you can see, if there was any doubt that this is carefully choreographed, why is it that the Americans have now passed a piece of legislation targeted at African countries, saying if African countries are going to collaborate with Russia in a manner that is deemed to be inimical to the interests of America, and by extension, therefore, inimical to the interests of NATO and inimical to the interests of the European Union, then pain will be caused to visit those African countries. We already know the sanction regimes which are being arrayed against a number of African countries, such as the Central African Republic and Mali. And some of these sanctions are being arrayed against those nations through African bodies such as ECOWAS, so that you don't see the sleight of hand of NATO, the sleight of hand of the European Union, but in a very surreptitious and a very subterranean manner, these bodies are once again using Africa as pawns in a political chessboard. So in my view, I do not hold the view that NATO and the European Union are innocent brokers in this ongoing war. I hold the view that without assigning blame, because any war that causes human misery, as the war in Ukraine is indeed causing, is one that ought to be condemned. Any war that causes misery ought to be condemned. And the truth be told, it is the reality today that even if a war is fought in distant lands, the world does suffer in some way. We already see how the sanction regime that has been arrayed against Russia is causing untold harm to a number of countries in terms of fuel shortages, in terms of the cost of grain, and everybody, even those who thought they would not be affected, are now being affected in one way or the other. But NATO and EU, in my view, are not playing the role that I thought they would. Because if today NATO and if today European Union were to say, for example, that they request the Russians and the Ukrainians to sign a modus vivendi, such a modus vivendi would then be the basis of restoring peace, and it would lead to an armistice in the manner in which we have between South Korea and North Korea, so that you stabilize the situation so that people can enter into negotiations in good faith. It would work. But when the message that comes from Washington and the message that comes from Brussels is that we are going to spend $45 billion to improve the armory of the Ukrainians, you are saying we want to show these Russians that we are going to root them out. And then you are legitimizing the unspoken position of Russia that it is now fighting NATO and the European Union. And as I conclude, therefore, the message that should come from men and women of goodwill is that Russia has a duty to rethink her position. NATO has a duty to rethink her position. The European Union has a duty to rethink their position. And this is where the African Union comes in. The African Union is a very weak organization. Some call it a toothless bulldog, but I sometimes doubt if it even has teeth. But whether it has teeth or not, or it is a toothless bulldog is another debate. if the African Union were to present herself as an innocent broker in this regard, then there is a sense in which we could urge these contestants and these combatants in NATO and EU and Russia to begin to consider peace as important for the world economy. And outside of the African Union, I'm quite certain that even within Asia, with countries such as China and India, if we were to work together and revive the spirit of the non-aligned movement, then we could urge NATO, we could urge the European Union, and we could urge Russia to negotiate in peace. Remember, as I conclude, all world wars have always been generated by these same people. It is the Europeans, it is the Americans who brought about and fought in the World War. It is the Soviet Union, now as Russia. We in Africa have always been drafted into these wars. These are warmongers by their DNA and by their practice and by their politics and by their economics. So when they tell you they love peace, they don't love peace. They now have an appetite for a third world war. Let us help them to save themselves from themselves. Thank you very much. Those are my contribution to this subject in which I have no expertise except curiosity. Thank you very much.
I can say, Prof, thank you so much for sharing your curiosity with us. And Prof says that they are warmongers and there is no appetite for peace. And so there is no peace to talk about in terms of NATO and EU. But I think I also enjoyed when he then spoke about the role of Africa and the fact that we are just being taken on board in terms of these wars. Maybe taking advantage of my position, Prof, I could also just ask and say, was it a good move for a number of African nations to abstain themselves in terms of voting for the resolution at the UN? As I think about 35 countries, and the majority of those were actually African to abstain from that resolution.
The volume is not very friendly to me. I wish you could have somebody just type it so that I read it out. For some reason, your volume is not very...
Okay, I will type that one, but I think I will now open the floor. You have heard what the Prof has said. He has spoken to a great length in terms of the background to the formation of NATO and also the background to the formation of the EU. And it's over to plenary now for those who have questions for the Prof. You can show by raising your hands. Can people hear me? I've just lost power in my office.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I see a hand from Masiwa. I think it's written Masiwa. I'm not sure if it's Reverend or what.
No, it's just Masiwa. So, okay. Prof, thank you. I don't want to call this a question, maybe a comment, but of which you can also comment on it, Prof. I hear you when you say on the onset, I think the World War II, which, like you rightly pointed, was European war, second one for that matter, had created a huge appetite for peace. And that NATO in this context might have been actually meant with the idea of peace in mind. However, I am thinking, Prof, after the World War, the rise of the so-called defense industry in both the USA and in Europe, how has the defense industry taken over NATO and thereby, in a way, maybe redirecting the interest of NATO from peace to war? Because now, if anything, what I have seen is the USA particularly encouraging, encouraging Ukraine on, so that the war could actually happen in a way. And I'm thinking there are people that are making money out of this. We are looking at war as killing people, which is true, but war is also making people filthy rich because they're supplying guns. They are making more guns than before because there is a market for the guns because there is war. So in a way, how are these different players contributing? Are the politicians, because I'm thinking in my mind, NATO is initially the product of politicians, but which has been taken over by the captains of the defense industries in Europe and in America.
Let me just weigh in. I can't disagree with you. I think that you are right in saying that if you look at the original reason for the creation of many of these post-World War bodies, I think the intentions were noble and genuine. One cannot quarrel with that. But I think that when the vision bearers die, there is a tendency to forget why we are fighting or why we established an organization. And war is a very lucrative industry. One of the things that surprises me, if you look at countries that look as innocent like Sweden, if you look at the amount of money that armaments contribute to their GDP, you will be amazed. And you will agree that the defense industry in Europe and America is one of the greatest contributors to their GDP. And war after war, and you stop in Afghanistan and you have lost your territory there, you are in Iraq, you are in Iran, you are in different places, and then suddenly you have Ukraine, and everybody is laughing to the proverbial bank. So I can't agree with you more that there are people who, out of very selfish and myopic interest, love that this kind of war is sustained, because the nature of war is that this is now an open war involving Ukraine and Russia. But even if the war were to stop, there will be low intensity wars, which will require light arms. So you always ensure that the pipeline is flowing. So because war is an industry, however defined. So I can't agree with you more in that assessment. Thank you very much.
Anyone else with a question for Prof. Simba Majara, Reverend Majara?
Thank you so much, Professor, for, I think, a rich presentation in what you claim not to be your area. My question is, of course, given the history that you highlighted, we know that after World War II, towards the end, the Bretton Woods Conference was hedged. And there were a lot of subtle interests, most of which the structures you mentioned, United Nations, World Bank, and other things, were hedged around that time. And some people are still benefiting from that today. Is there a new such conference in the making? That's my question. Thank you.
Let me, perhaps you'll allow me this to be my last answer, because I have to go for an alumni meeting at which I'm speaking. But let me use it to answer a number of questions which I've seen raised, but start with yours. And once again, you don't have to agree with me on this. When I look at the decolonization process and the number of bodies created at that time, that this was the age of deep forward thinking by the European powers after the World War II. Remember that the United States of America had never been a colonizer in the classical sense. But after the World War II, it was filling a vacuum. And that vacuum was making the United States of America the new hegemon in the bloc. And how do you fill it? You've had Marshall, Secretary Marshall say, we are going to help these Europeans to revive their factories, to revive everything. We have the Marshall Plan, we are lending to them. Therefore, economically, you are benefiting out of this scheme. At that time, also in Bretton Woods, they are creating the International Monetary Fund and the entire institution of the World Bank. And you have these newly independent African countries which will also need financing. So how do you control them? You control them, number one, by ensuring that they are in your financial loop. And once they're in your financial loop, you control the past. You also ensure that militarily they are weak, because international economic and international relationship is about fear, is about the ability to fight and defend yourself. Africa is weak because militarily we are weak. So that I keep on telling my friend that it only takes the United States of America to have a warship on the next to Senegal, one next to Angola, one next to South Africa, one next to Kenya, and one in the Mediterranean Sea. And within 1 month, all the African armies will have been liquidated. And I say that when you are weak and in that way, and the others are strong in that way, there is a sense in which you realize that that strength militarily and otherwise is the guarantor of your being hegemonic. And I think that there is now a new scramble and a new dispensation is emerging, which is telling the conceptual West led by the United States of America that you've got to regroup. You've got to be regrouped because the China that we did not think about has come up. And this China is having its footprint in Africa. It is having a footprint in Latin America. It is having a footprint in Asia. Therefore, we've got to reorganize. We've got to scramble. And this is why, in my view, you see the fast tracking of the consideration of the applications of Finland, of Sweden, the applications of Ukraine, because you are acquiring new territory as a bulwark against China. So I can't agree with you more that there is a new world order which is reshaping. Look even at the behavior of the United Kingdom after her exit from the European Union. See how you now see a Commonwealth on steroids. It is a Commonwealth that is energized. They are quick to admit Togo. They are quick to admit Gabon, and they are waiting to gobble what France is losing. It is only we Africans who are visitors in Jerusalem. We don't appear to know what is happening, which leads me to answer the question, should we have abstained? Abstention sometimes is a tool of the weak. When there is a moral struggle between that which is good and that which is bad, to abstain is to be hypocritical and to be weak. And I hold the view that the African Union should have had an extraordinary meeting and said, we are going to take this position. And you remember under the non-aligned movement, they used to say, we are non-aligned but positively neutral. In other words, we are not aligned to either the East or the West. But when there is a moral case, we are going to take sides with what we consider to be morally correct. But this behaving like a hyena, which Africans behave like hyena, going to the East, and will make us burst asunder. So I agree with you as I conclude by saying, yes, the world is reorganizing. The West now sees mortal danger, both at different levels. It sees mortal danger militarily. It sees mortal danger economically. It sees mortal danger culturally. Remember, the Chinese are also building Confucius centers everywhere in the world. And they are saying, if we are not very careful, the world is going to change before our very eyes. And we Africans are not present at the dinner table. We Africans are playing the gooseberry. We Africans can't be ignored. We are only waiting and waiting to consider which side we shall follow, which side shall lead us by the nose. And the time is now for Africa to wake up and to redefine our foreign policy, to define how we engage with the world militarily, to define how we engage culturally. It is only in that way that we are going to survive as respected members of the International Committee. I believe that those ideas do just add value to what you have said, with which I agree. So thank you very much for that question.
Thank you so much, Prof, for those inputs. And I would probably say it's not just a curious person, but someone who has a lot of expertise. So thank you so much as you
Thank you very much.
Meeting.
I wish you the very best. God bless you.
Thank you very much, Prof. And in the time that is remaining, I'm sure that we can continue to discuss the issue. Prof concluded that we should have said EU and NATO sustaining the war, because they really do not have a role in terms of sustainable peace, because they lost the opportunity for them to be able to talk about sustainable peace in terms of Russia and Ukraine. I see a hand from Dr. Ashford. The floor is yours, Dr. Ashford.
Yes, thank you very much, my sister Justina. It's nice to see you again and see that you are continuing to shine. God bless you for that. I just wanted to pick up the issue about abstention by African countries at the UN during that time of the resolution. For me, that is a very clear sign of what I call silent communication, where the Africans, knowing ourselves that we are still running with begging bowls in our hands, it is very difficult for us to be open and transparent where that is required. I will give you an example. I was just reading this morning. Curiously, I came across a Newsday article in Zimbabwe there, which is talking about the Chinese donating a parliament to Zimbabwe. Now, that is a very clear communication by the Chinese people that Zimbabwe will never say anything against China. And it is across the African continent. I just finished reading a book talking about the Chinese recolonization of the African continent. And I can tell you that in that book, I got the shock of my day about the Chinese enterprises in the continent. Now, given Russia and how Russia has assisted most African countries in the liberation struggle, which we are grateful for. However, Africa, because we lack, we have the resources, but we don't have the manufacturing processes to process it. So we have to keep exporting, and we remain vassals of such countries as Russia. And so if Russia is involved in a conflict, such as it has now with Ukraine, rather than coming out openly against Russia, we cannot do that because we still have a begging bowl in our hands and kneeling and salivating for whatever goodies we will get from Russia. So we will keep quiet and we will abstain from voting. And we know that abstention doesn't change anything. Abstention for me is actually voting, but voting in a silent way. And we see what it meant and what the result was. Ukraine is being destroyed in our own eyes, and Russia is not going to stop. So for me, as long as we have these begging bowls in our hands, we will continue to abstain where we need to actually take a stand and say, this one we don't like. Here we stand and no further. That's what I would say in that regard.
Thank you very much for that input. I had also seen hands from Reverend Manzongo. It's good to see you on this platform, and also from Kudzaishe. So Reverend Manzongo first, and then Kudzaishe.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask a question on what the Prof was saying, that the European countries are warmongers, while least I was just looking at the two sides, the Europeans as warmongers, but also looking at us as Africans. What are we also doing on our side? Because yes, these can thrive on that, but also what should we be known for? I hear he talks about us being brokers of peace, but also at the same time, how can we broker peace if we are not strong militarily, like what he was saying? So these were the questions that were coming to me. And also he talks about the defense industry, that people are gaining out of this. I also wanted to ask him about the philanthropy industry, because looking at it on what's happening in the globe, we now even have degrees in philanthropy and social entrepreneurship. So I also wanted him to comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that input. But I would say what Dr. Msodza also said about Africa could also probably answer you a bit. But obviously, I think you will appreciate that Prof is an expert on another level. Obviously would have probably come up with a different view. I'm recognizing that there is a message in the chat from Tsitsi, and Tsitsi says, abstaining, I believe, was a bad idea. They should have stood up and say what they believe in. And I had also said Kudzaishe had his hand up. Kudzaishe, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much.
Before you come on, Kudzaishe, if anyone wants to respond to Reverend Manzongo, let's have that conversation. We are not experts. Probably we are just curious about what is happening in Russia and Ukraine. So let's bring in those ideas. The Prof said it, that he was not an expert and someone who's just curious about what is happening around us. So let's feel free to share ideas. Over to you, Kudzaishe.
Okay, thank you so much, Maim Koko, for stating this view in a swift manner. And thank you so much, of course, Prof, now in absentia, for all the contributions that he did give in this presentation. Well, I wanted to comment a little bit on the abstaining part by many African countries, especially back in Zimbabwe. We have seen how the price of fuel is going up almost twice every month. And in the streets there, some will just tell you it's because of the war in Ukraine, because of the war in Russia. In as much as I'm not really aware, or I don't really know, because I'm not like an expert in that area. But I think abstaining for Zimbabwe was really a bad idea, because if we are to go by that speculation, that the war in Ukraine is causing it's not only Zimbabwe that's been affected by the price of oil going up, but many countries. And from my reading and from missing news and international news platforms, we realize that many countries are being affected. So abstaining, I mean, really, I see on Dr. Gunda's profile, there's Martin Luther King. I'm just reminded that he says that silence in the terms of oppression, you've actually chosen the side of the oppressor. So us abstaining, we might think that we abstained, but actually we might have actually did make our own, choose our own side by us abstaining and making silent. And we are also the victims. I mean, we are receiving the results of what the war that is going. So I think every country should never abstain from that. I agree with what is written in the comment box, but we have stood for what we believe in. Look at us now. We are just helpless there around, and receiving the effects day by day. So I wanted just to make that short comment. Thank you so much, Ms. Nko.
Thank you very much, Kuzaishe. I see Dr. Masiwa Gunda has got his hand up.
Thank you.
The
Thank
floor
you,
is
Sister
yours.
Justina. Yes, I wanted to engage with Reverend Manzongo on philanthropy and how it has really grown up. And I think I want to encourage us to also be very intentional in how we evaluate some of these things. I think one of the key discussions taking place in the world of philanthropy and in NGOs is the decolonization of aid, of philanthropy, and all these other things. Because you see, the thing is that dominance does not always come in one form. Some years ago, we were discussing, the different ways in which gender-based violence emerges in communities. That when a man is working, they use soft power to be very dominant by passing economic sanctions on the family, right? But if they lose their job, it does not mean they will accept that their position of dominance has ended. They will find a new way of asserting their dominance, either by turning to physical violence and so on and so forth. So the truth is that the global north has always felt entitled to dominating the world. At some point, they did so through conquest, imperialism, right? Coupled with cultural imperialism, turning us to become and to aspire to be like them. But at some point, this model was defeated. But their interest to dominate was not defeated. So it's not a coincidence that philanthropy is a big topic in the global north, but it is still directed. It's not like in the US, there are no homeless people because they are there. In Europe, there are homeless people. There are people that are struggling. And this is why Blacks and other immigrants are hated so much in these countries. The reason, there are poor people that are not being helped by this system. But it's the system that's creating philanthropy for Africa, philanthropy for Asia. What is this? Is this really philanthropy? Or is this soft power, but still with the same interest to dominate Africa? Who decides on these things? So in a way, I think, Rev, let's keep on talking about this. But I think there is more to what we are seeing than simply people that are of good heart. And some of them, I engage with people. You have benefited from centuries of slavery. And some of these former slave owners are the greatest philanthropists today, but they don't want to pay reparations for the harm they caused. But they want to be philanthropists. So I think we need to engage more and be more intentional and critical about what is happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gunda. And Dr. Gunda says philanthropy is a facade. There are more fangs under this facade that is kind of blinding us. And he also speaks about how the North feels entitled that they should dominate the world. If they lose on one button, they will go on and take on another one. And in the chat from Professor Biri, she says a real bone of contention concerning involvement of Africa in the Russian-Ukraine war to what extent will Africa be able to focus on her vast challenges and problems? That's a question to all of us.
Justina, can I come in?
Yes, you may, Reverend Micton.
Thank you very much, Justina. I don't want to answer that particular question that you last read, but I just wanted to come back maybe to what Tsitsi said, commented to this comment. You know, my thinking is for us to be sustainable peacemakers, and for Africa and Zimbabwe in particular, if they were to be sustainable peacemakers, or maybe they were to vote against the war in Russia, whatever way that we think they were supposed to behave, instead of running away from it and taking and making silence on it. There is not a point in this world where peace makers are going to give us sustainable peace as long as they are subject to some kind of superpowers and they are not independent. Because like what Reverend Kudzi was saying, Zimbabwe cannot speak out and say, even if we don't believe in what is going on in Russia right now, we cannot stand up and say this is wrong, because the moment we say this is wrong, we are not self-sustainable. Russia will cut us off in certain things, you know. So for us to make sure that we continue to get those things, which are unfortunately, in most cases, they benefit the elites. So now, as long as Africa is not self-sustainable and self-sufficient, Africa cannot stand up and say we believe in this, and we don't believe in that. So as long as we are not independent, as long as we are not producing what we are supposed to be producing, as long as we don't have the capacity to feed ourselves, as long as we don't have the capacity to protect ourselves, you name it, we cannot stand up against our superpowers. We cannot stand up against the ones that are supplying us with whatever that we need. So we'll continue to be puppets of them, even though we don't agree to what they are doing. So in a sense, we are losing our identity, we are losing our dignity continually as Africans, because we are not building capacity in ourselves to be self-sustainable. The moment we build that capacity, the moment, that is when we get the freedom. And when we have that freedom, we have that independence. And if we have that independence, then we can now say, this is not it. What gives the superpowers the authority and the leverage to say whatever that they want to say, even if the whole world is going the other way, is because they know the United States of America can just stand up and say, okay, everyone is going right and I'm going left, because at the end of the day, they don't need much from everyone else. They are independent. They can sustain themselves to a higher degree. So for as long as Africa is still where it is today, we cannot. So we would say Africa should have done this, Zimbabwe should have done that, South Africa should have done that. But the problem is, are we independent? We need to be independent first to be peace builders who advocate for a sustainable peace. And as long as we are not that, we cannot do that. And unfortunately, it affects the negative impacts affects the ordinary citizens. You know, Reverend Kudzi mentioned that fuel prices are going up, but the elites will not feel it. You know, so it's unfortunate, but I feel unless a time we are totally independent and self-sustainable, that's when we can rise up as Africa and be heard. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if anyone wants to answer Professor Biri's question. To what extent will Africa be able to focus on her vast challenges and problems?
Before they answer, my sister, I just thinking right now of Walter Rodin's book, published in 1972, very popular. I remember using it at A-level history, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. He documents the process of civilization in Africa, as Africa is the cradle of mankind, and how Europe came to interrupt the process of development in Africa. And at the end, in other words, he is simply saying Europe hijacked the development in Africa. And my point is, we have African leaders who are failing to protect their own. I was discussing with some colleagues that it's really tough for us. There are do's and don'ts. For example, I've stayed in Germany. There are rules and regulations to comply with. You have limitations because you are a foreigner. But this is not the same. In most African countries, they enjoy rights over us, the indigenous people. I'm not racist. I don't believe in racism or tribalism, but we are weighing our livelihoods versus those of foreigners in our country, in our continent. And you see that it seems the leaders protect foreigners more than us. And this is where what Dr. Gunda was saying, trying to decolonize philanthropy. And our leaders create room to sort of affirm the selfish European interest, because there are poor people in Europe. I've seen them in the streets begging, and they are donating. They have philanthropic work in Africa, yet we have vast resources. Alongside that, we have leaders accumulating a lot, ignoring their own people. And back to Dr. Gunda's presentation on treaties, that's why I asked, whose interest do these political alliances save? I'm thinking of the past decades here, when we had these mega deals on our national television, mega deal with China, mega deal with Russia. But later on, we are told, remain resolute. Rambai Makashinga, and the sanctions thesis is advanced. And I always question then, why does it benefit me and my children to support Russian-Ukraine war? I'm back now to how Europe developed Africa. Don't we learn from the past? Have any European country get involved in Southern Africa squabbles, the political unrest, the challenges in West Africa again? France busy looting resources in Francophone Africa. And then that's why I'm saying, then why should African leaders be involved in the war instead of sorting out their problems at home so that they create a united Africa? That's my take on this. It's not wrong to be involved in Russian-Ukraine war, because on an international scale, we are part of the global development, and we also need not to sit, but to participate. But how do we participate? What is our entry point into the Russo-Ukrainian war when we have a full plate, overflowing plate of problems and challenges? When our people, the cycle of poverty on the continent, only a few elite are getting richer, benefiting from the alliances, the political parts. And then what justification do we have for these leaders to participate in a war, which we already feel the impact? We're talking about fuel, grains, and so forth. Whereas us here in my motherland, we have serious challenges. And how does it benefit the ordinary citizen? Because this is my issue. It's about our livelihoods. It's about us learning from the past, learning from history. If Europe underdeveloped us yesterday, does it have the zeal and the capacity to promote our development right now? This is my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And I fully subscribe to what you have said, that when we go to some of these countries, there are these rules that if you break them, you can actually die in prison. I think you speak about Germany, but I think the same applies to China. They are not very liberal in terms of their rules when it comes to foreigners. But when they come here, they've got a kind of a soft landing. I think because the elite is kind of benefiting from a lot that they are involved in. Reverend Micton, you wanted to come in there. And yes, before you come in, let me just read what Reverend Majara has said. If philanthropy is not revolutionary, I'm wondering how it can offer life-transforming relief to the suffering humankind. Please feel free to also answer that if I also see Reverend Manzongo's hand there.
Thank you
Over
very much.
to you, Reverend Micton.
Thank you, Justina. I want to try and comment on what Professor Biri is just saying to us. I think I'll start by saying that maybe we need to go back and relook at what we call independence and colonization, because in my view, we only switched, we changed the person who was driving the bus, but we did not change the bus, because colonization for me is a system, and that is still in place in many African countries. And that very same system has indebted Africa. African countries are made to believe, or it is on paper, that they owe it to the superpowers. So because of that now, and this debt is being sustained by the systems that they have put in place, even after leaving our lands and our borders. Talk of Zimbabwe, for instance. I still believe Zimbabwe is still colonized, because every system that we have, if not 90%, or if not all of the systems that we use are colonial. You know, so those systems now, they have put Africa in a position whereby we continue to owe the superpowers and the former colonizers. So in so doing, that system has been crafted deliberately to make sure that Africa cannot focus now on development for themselves. Africa cannot focus on economic growth. Africa cannot focus on building better infrastructure. Why? Because we always have to pay back what we owe the colonial masters. So you find that, for example, all the debts that we have in Zimbabwe, a good majority of it was through ISAP, and this was a deliberate move just to make sure that Zimbabwe will live in debt and will spend much of our time trying to pay back, and we can't be paying back and developing at the same time. This was deliberate. So the problem that we have in Africa, I think it also answers the question, why can they just leave the issue in Ukraine and focus on their local countries? We cannot afford to do that, because if we owe Russia because they helped us during the Liberation War and they continue to help us, if they are in trouble, or if there is a decision that needs to be made and we have to make a choice, we have to stop everything and focus on Russia, you know, because we owe them. We are indebted to them. So I think the only way we can start to focus on ourselves, we can start to develop ourselves, we can start to maybe to develop economically, whatever, all those independence dreams that we have, I think is when we stand up and we have a critical population of people in Africa who are willing to stand up and question the superpowers and question even the leaders and stand up against any form of neo-colonialism that is prevalent in Africa today. We need the independence to start focusing on ourselves. Otherwise, if we don't have that, then we are in for a fix. I still believe most African countries do not have that independence. Yes, the colonial masters have left the borders, but their systems are still in place. And those systems are what I call colonization for me, because systems work better than individuals who are sitting on a chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Reverend Micton. I will now have Reverend Manzongo. And I think there is a question for Dr. Gunda, but before that, I will read a chart from Andrew, and it says, if the world is a global village as claimed, are we not supposed to participate in the affairs of our village, war in Ukraine included? And then a question for Dr. Gunda, what might be some of the similarities and differences between the tension in ancient Israel and the tension in Ukraine. But I also recognize that you already had your hand up. So I will have Reverend Manzongo and then Dr. Gunda. And I think the last person that I will take will be Masiwa, who has got his hand up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mother. Masiwa na Gunda mumwe chete muno. Okay, allow me to take this to everyday examples. I'm a priest, and in the church, priests are always accused of being friends with those people who are rich. So they say. So they will say, oh, you never become a church warden. So maybe in the Anglican church, it's a church warden, or Methodist is a gosa. You never have someone to be a church warden without a car. And true, because we have meetings that people should attend, and you must be driving in order for you to attend that meeting. And also even in meetings, people who speak and people who are applauded whenever they speak are those people who have something to show for it. Why am I saying this? As long as Africa, we don't make money and we are not people of a status, we will not have a voice and we will not find a seat at the table. We can talk all we want and say we must have a voice in what's going on within the global village. But everyone knows that at the meeting of the village, whenever we gather, Marombe hana chanotaura chine musoro, they will remain just like that. So until and unless we start to be self-sufficient, without begging, without waiting for anyone, without putting aid as part of our budget, without waiting for remittances from the diaspora, we'll never have a voice at the village gathering. I think those are my comments as far as the African voice is concerned in what's happening within the globe. Then also we were talking about soft landing, people coming from outside, having privilege. So you talk about South Africa, there is xenophobia, but those people who are coming from Europe, no one touches them, no one talks to them that they are foreigners, but fellow African brothers and sisters are the ones who are being attacked. Let me take that again to everyday life. Mwana w'Mukwasha aanetswe kana akaenda kwambuya, anoita zvaanoda kana ari kwambuya, because mbuya knows where her bread is being buttered. Mwana wawo mukomana anogona kutoudzwa kuti muteme panapa ndeyakati, but mwana w'Mukwasha angona kutosiyiwa achiita zvaanenge achiita. So I think those are my remarks, just taking them to everyday life and for us to see what's happening. We get a few droppings from these people, and obviously when their children come home, when their children come to us, we dare not touch them, because once we lay our hand on an American who is in Zimbabwe, then we are doomed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reverend Manzongo. You were starting on another one in terms of the Anglican Church. I suppose it's a discussion for another day. But I think I like your practical example in terms of Mwana w'Mukwasha. I think an argument that I have had is ambuya vanenge vachiti uyu ndinoziya ndakaona ari mudumbu remwana wangu, which is very different in terms of panouya muroora. It's a totally different situation, because vari kutivo nhumbu takaiona asi handina chokwadi kuti ndewe mwana wangu here kana kuti kwete. That's why vana vevakwasha vachiwana preferential treatment. That's by the wayside. Dr. Gunda, to kind of tie all loose ends, I'm sorry to give you this task, but we need to be coming to a conclusion.
Thank you, Justina. Yes, and I agree completely with you. Mwana mkwasha muzukuru chaye chaye. Mwana mwanakomana anogona ngari muzukuru. So I guess it explains why mai would say chako chimwana semwanakomana ngachifambe neshoka chomkwasha che chakaberekwa. Wachinda nazvo kuclub kana kuti chemwanakomana chosara kubva wemukwasha ndiye anoendewa nawo kuma-meeting nei. Because yes, but thank you. I would say, let me begin with Reverend Gusha's question. Rev, I'm always very skeptical of drawing lines of connection between 2,000-3,000 years ago and today. Ukraine and Israel back in the day. But here are some things that you can also think about and problematize as we try to understand what is happening. Ukraine, in a way, is a country that has always been a land bridge between Western Europe and Eastern Europe and Asia, in a way. And which is why Russia takes particular interest in Ukrainian politics. So you always have in Ukrainian politics pro-Western Europe faction against the pro-Russian faction. So depending with what is happening, if a pro-Russian faction wins the election, then the leadership and those people that find their chances, particularly the Russian-speaking Ukrainians, they find that a good way of relating with Russia. But the other Ukrainians, especially non-Russian speaking Ukrainians, ordinary Ukrainians, think there are more pickings for them if they are in a relationship with the EU. And which is why of late, it was pro-Western European political factions winning. But the thing is, Ukraine is just a football field. It is not the football, it is not the player. Russia and the EU and the US are the players, and they choose to play their football match in Ukraine. You see, one thing that's common with Russia and the EU and the US is they love war for as long as it's not happening in their own backyard. So Ukraine is a perfect foil for that. They are fighting. We know this is a war between Russia and the EU and NATO and the US, but they say they are not fighting. The US says we don't want to fight Russia, but we know this is what is happening. Ukraine is just serving as a platform for these guys to test themselves. The ordinary people are always the greatest losers. Now, if you see Ukraine before the war and you look at Ukraine today, the lives of the ordinary people have been pushed back by 50 years. Now, they are to rebuild those lives for themselves. So however we look at it, when alliances go wrong, the ordinary people are the greatest losers. Now, I want to just finish off by noting one or 2 points. First, I think as Africa, the biggest mistake we made from the 1960s was actually to rush for seats on the global platform before we had made our houses or we had put our houses in order. We were very quick to want a voice at the UN. We were very quick to rush for summits with China, with Russia, with the US, with France, with all these global powers. And this is why our presidents, our leaders in Africa are so different on the global stage. Our president is the most powerful man when he is in Zimbabwe. But he is so disrespected, so powerless on the global stage. But look at the American president. The American president, as soon as he boards Air Force One and leaves American airspace, he becomes the world's most powerful man. But as soon as he gets back into American airspace, he is not the most powerful individual in America because the people don't rely on their president for day-to-day survival. Most Americans can live without the generosity or the philanthropy of the president or his wife. So what do we have? We have an empowered leadership and a disempowered masses. This creates an unhealthy balance in our society. So until and unless we begin to empower the grassroots, to raise the level of consciousness in the grassroots, we will continue to live with this unbalanced system, a sort of a kwashiorkor that we have as a society. The best way for Africa is to learn from Singapore. And I hope that in future, the Global Institute for Peace will make Singapore a case study for us. Because what I see in Singapore is an alliance between leaders and the people. An alliance that said, if we say everybody must tighten their belts, it means everybody must tighten their belts from the leadership. In fact, beginning with the leadership. We don't do the kind of things that says, let us tighten our belts. But what do we see? Our leaders are actually loosening because they are ballooning. As we tighten ours, they loosen theirs. No, that is not an alliance. That's not an agreement. What transformed Singapore was a proper alliance between the leaders and the people, in which if we were making sacrifices, everybody makes sacrifices. We can't have a situation where I make a sacrifice, but my minister changes his car every year. I'm driving a car that I've been driving for the past 10 years. Why can't my minister drive at least for 5 years? So let's work on grassroots consciousness. Let us make our people realize they have a stake in what happens. And churches, we are the greatest culprits because we continue to tell people that their real life will come in heaven. That what is happening here is this worldly. But I think churches are saying in a way, God is a fool. Because why, with all the power that God has, why did God not create us in heaven? There must be a reason why we are on earth. And that reason is not to try and force our way to heaven. God will invite us to heaven when the time comes. For now, we have a responsibility to this earth. I think the church needs to play its part. Thank you.
Dr. Gunda, thank you very much for those thought-provoking ideas that you have shared with us. I also want to add and say that alliance with the grassroots will never be allowed, I think, from what we are seeing now, because what we are already seeing is that space is already being shrunk so that the grassroots cannot be accessed, and at the end of the day, they will not have information. They will not know what is happening, and they will not be able to demand accountability. And I like the idea of the platform of the church, because on a daily or weekly basis, it's the church that gathers the bulk of citizens as they come to pray. And unless we are able to drive messages through the church, we might not have the alliance that you are talking about. And we will not be able to have the critical mass of the grassroots. Tsitsi, is it burning? Because I really wanted to close. Tsitsi?
Oh, okay. Just 1 minute.
Okay.
Just a few seconds. I just wanted to agree with the last speaker. And that's the question I had for Baba Manzongwe, Gusha, and everybody about the church. The grassroots, it has to begin with the church. Titatange tasmutana papa na papa. Tinokudziridza vanhu vane zvinzvimbo. Tichisiya vari pasi. That's how we are all getting all these issues from. Kana kuchurches, nonzi baba, hatitange nevari pamusoro. So if we start from there, patiri susuka, I think we'll have a better person. No minister hangawane migirikino uyu. Katange nevanhu vari kushupika. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tsitsi, and I think you were on time. And at this stage, I only have to thank Father Gusha, who happens to be my former student, for giving me the opportunity to be on this platform. And at this stage, I hand back the reins to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for accepting to be sent by your student. We thank you all for participating in this platform. The discussion was so enlightening, and it was now picking up momentum. But this is not the end, but this is the end of our first 2 sessions. As we are speaking in less than 2 hours, in nearly 2 hours time, then we're having the last speaker who happens to be somewhere now doing other things. I think this is the speaker who also now coming from the experience, being a politician, a minister of finance, and so forth. Whether some of these things you'll be speaking from inside the point of view, we don't know. But thank you all, Dr. Gunda, my former lecturer, Justina Koko, my former high school teacher, Professor Bibiri, my former university, my university lecturer again. So that's why I was quiet most of the time, because I was listening to my students, getting the opportunity again to learn from you. But this is not the end. We are breaking, we're taking a longer break, since we have been sitting from 2 up to now, almost 3 hours sitting. So it's befitting for us to take this 2-hour break. But the only closing the session, our platform session, we're going to leave something for entertainment. And those who want to take this as an opportunity just to chat, it's another opportunity. While we need to wait for the final speakers to come, then we finish. We take note of all the recommendations that have been put, the recommendations about the next focus that have been raised by Dr. Gunda. The church, I think you have a lot of work to do. Those who know the mission of the Ranking Church, the 5 marks of mission, they're very clear and very focused. But the issue is, how do we implement those 5 marks? We can have beautiful documents, but the implementation, that's where the challenge is. Because if anyone Google on our 5 marks of mission, it's Anglican Communion, for example, is part of one church, you realize that it addresses these issues that were raised here. But the issue now goes back to implementation, and also how do we work from an ecumenical perspective when we look at the wider church. That becomes also a challenge. So thank you very much. I hoping that we'll meet again in the next